Mr Speaker,
I call Sue Keedsley.
I move that the Animal Welfare Treatment of Animals Amendment Bill be now read a first time. Mr Speaker, Parliament has a chance tonight to right a terrible wrong and to end the suffering that millions of factory-farmed animals experience every day of their short and miserable lives so that we can have access to cheaper meat and eggs. And Parliament also has a chance tonight to respond to the overwhelming desire of New Zealanders to get rid of cruel farming practices such as the sow crate and the battery hen cage by supporting this bill. Mr Speaker, animals have no vote in this Parliament. They have no voice and they cannot vote, and so it is up to us to speak on their behalf and to protect them from cruelty and abuse. And that is why every member of Parliament in this House tonight has a stark choice to make, whether they will vote for the animals or for the vested interests who want to be able to keep animals in cages indefinitely. That is the stark choice that every MP will make tonight, and whatever weasel words are said, MPs who vote against my bill will be voting to allow animal cruelty to continue indefinitely. Mr Speaker, public concern about animal welfare has been growing steadily in recent years. New Zealanders were repelled at what they saw on television last year. Images of pigs with sores all over their bodies, looking demented, chewing bars, and they cannot understand why Parliament has sat on its hands and done nothing since then to stop this cruelty. And they certainly won't understand if Parliament rejects this bill, which would require sow crates and other cruel practices to be phased out within 5 years. Most people cannot understand either why it is that Parliament allows millions of factory-farmed animals to be grievously ill-treated on a daily basis when we have an Animal Welfare Act that says it's an offence to ill-treat animals. If it's an offence to ill-treat animals, people ask me, why isn't it an offence to ill-treat animals by locking them in cages where they cannot even turn around? And the answer is that while the Animal Welfare Act has some very good principles, it contains a series of loopholes which exempt the worst cases of animal cruelty in factory farms from having to comply with the Act. And these loopholes mean that even though the National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee acknowledges that using sow stalls for prolonged periods of time doesn't meet the obligations of the Act, but it can still recommend that sow crates continue by using the exceptional circumstances exemption in section 73 of the Act. And this explains why we've ended up with an Act which pretends to protect the interests of animals, but which really protects the interests of farmers and animal users, an Act which allows us to get tough on individual acts of cruelty and turn a blind eye to institutional acts of cruelty, an Act which makes it an offence to keep a dog in a cage, but says it's legitimate and somehow not cruel to keep a pig or a hen in a cage. An Act which allows one standard for companion animals and a completely different and lax standard for the treatment of farm animals. My bill removes this contradiction at the core of the Animal Welfare Act and says that any practice that breaches the Act but which is permitted under the exceptional circumstances exemption must be phased out within 5 years, and it also expands the definition of the needs of animals to include having freedom of movement and sufficient space to express normal patterns of behaviour, and it gives the Minister power to amend an animal welfare code if they consider this necessary to prevent the suffering of any animal. Now, the Minister will trot out a series of feeble excuses as to why the National Party opposes this bill. but the public will see them for what they are, the feeble excuses of a party that is casting around for an excuse to try to justify why it pretends it's all in favour of animal welfare, yet will vote to allow some of the worst cases of animal cruelty to continue indefinitely. Now, the Minister will no doubt argue that the survival of the pig and poultry industries will be at risk if we require cruel farming practices to be phased out within 5 years. But he knows this is nonsense, for it ignores the fact that 60% of pig farmers don't use sow crates and that free-range producers are booming in New Zealand, while the mainstream pork industry is losing market share to imported pork. Some free-range producers expanded their market share last year by an extraordinary 170%. The Managing Director of Freedom Farms says it's absurd that the pork industry is clinging to cruel farming practices at the very time that consumers are clamouring for meat from animals that have been well treated. Instead of behaving like King Canutes, he says, they should be developing a niche for themselves as producers of quality, humanely raised meat. Mr. Speaker, animal welfare is above all an ethical and moral issue, not an economic one. Some farmers may wish it were otherwise. They may wish it was left up to them to decide whether they consider it profitable to treat animals humanely or not. But the truth is that the reason people feel passionately about animal welfare is because it is an ethical and moral issue. Our attitudes to animal welfare and this bill hinge around ethical arguments, such as do we have a right to require highly intelligent animals such as pigs to live miserable lives of suffering just to satisfy our demand for cheap meat, especially when we can farm them well in free-range conditions where they can express normal patterns of behaviour. There is a substantial body of international research which shows that animals experience a huge range of emotions and suffer terribly when they cannot express normal behaviour. And that is why I am seeking a conscience vote on this bill. It is incomprehensible and deeply offensive to me that Parliament would allow gambling and shopping hours to be voted as a conscience issue, but not animal welfare. It's a sure sign that vested interests have won out over the interests of animals yet again. Mr. Speaker, animal cruelty is animal cruelty, whether it happens to a pig or a dog. We cannot, in good conscience, as a Parliament, get tough on individual acts of cruelty to animals while ignoring the more serious cases of institutional abuse. We cannot have one law for companion animals and another law for farm animals. And we cannot pretend that it is not cruel to keep a pig or a hen in a cage when it would be illegal and a breach of the Act to keep a cat or a dog in a cage. Mr. Speaker, I have been inside factory farms, numerous factory farms. I have seen for myself the pain and the agony that sows experience when they're locked inside cages, either desperate with boredom or screaming in agony. I have seen with my own eyes pigs lying motionless in their cages, chewing on their bars in deranged frustration. I have tried to take a cross-party group of MPs to visit pig farms to see for themselves the suffering that sows endure in sow crates, but the pork industry has refused to allow our visit. Mr. Speaker, I believe every MP in this House would like to see an end to the sow crate and the battery hen cage, and the only reason some are voting against this bill is because their party whips are demanding that they do so. I would like to thank the Labour Party, the Maori Party, the United Future Party, the Progressive Party and Chris Carter for supporting my bill. And I would like to say to MPs who are opposing this bill that their vote will be a conscience issue, whether they like it or not, and it will be something that they will have to live with for a very long time.
Members, the question is that the motion be